Okay, so now that all the parts are clean, degreased, everything looks beautiful, it's time to put this back together. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you a little heads up on the motor. So this didn't come with a motor, but this technical motor is the motor that would have come with it. It's one of their best motors, and for the time, at least anyways, it was one of their best motors. This was their top of the line, so to speak. So the thing I wanted to show you on this motor was there are 2 screws in the front. These 2 screws aren't mounting screws. The mounting holes are right here. These 2 screws, if you loosen them just a little bit, allow you to set the timing on this. And where the battery contacts are here, there's a notch right there, and then you'll see these little tiny notches here on the case. Okay, the reason for those timing notches is by loosening these 2 screws on the front, you can turn this, and if this little notch goes up to this longest bar at the top there, that's 0 timing, that's 0 degrees. Okay, we have it set just below to the next largest bar below it. And what this does is, if I was to set this timing with this notch here all the way to the bottom bar, that'll give me the fastest speed, but it'll suck up the battery. Okay, I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? If I move this to the very top bar there, the small one at the very top, it'll give me more battery life, but it will reduce the speed. So you kind of have to find, when you were racing, you kind of had to find a median, to give you just enough battery life to finish the race. And that way you have the optimum speed all the time. So that's what this motor is all about, is setting the timing. So this is the motor that we're going to be putting back into this to make this period correct. So let's go ahead and start this process here. First thing we're going to do is put the motor plate back on. And what I did is, I'm not going to use Phillips screws. I'm basically going to use hex screws from now on. So this requires 2 8mm hex screws there. Make sure I got the right Allen wrench here. These are 3mm screws. Okay, so we've got the motor in place. We're going to put a pinion gear. Now, originally you used a 22 tooth gear. I don't have a 22 tooth gear. This one I think is 19 or 20, but it still has the same pitch as the gear that it's going to mesh against. So we're going to go ahead and just use this one for now. We can always change it later. And I'm just leaving a little bit of gap. This can always be adjusted later as well, but I'm just leaving a little bit of gap between the motor plate and the spur gear. We can pick that up. There we go. Okay, next on our agenda is gear case. And this requires these are 3mm screws again. These are 8mm and one 10mm. And this plate goes in just like that. Okay, the 8mm screws are these three here. Where's the top? And then the 10mm screw is this guy right here. It's a pan head screw, so use one of these because it's countersunk here. So I like to use machine screws instead of self-tapping screws. For one, there's more thread to them, so it'd be harder to strip because they're fine threads. So hence that's why I'm not using the self-tapping screws and prefer the machine screws here. So that 10mm screw here we're not going to use because we use the flathead here. And now I have two 10mm length 3mm screws that are 10mm in length and a couple of lock nuts. I think originally they had you put they had you put the regular nuts. They weren't lock nuts, and then you had to put a washer on the other side. But because we're using lock nuts, I don't think that we're gonna really need the washer on the other side of these. So and put this here together. This will go something like this. So there's two holes here that it lines up with. One's here at the bottom and the other one's here towards the top. So we're going to go ahead and put this screw in here first. And the other one goes here. Now this one is adjustable, so it helps the motor move, the pinion move a little bit, so that way you get the proper mesh later. So, you know, on this one we might want to put a washer in here. So let me do that real quick here. The reason I'm opting to use a washer here is this has a bit of a gap. I don't want this, the head of this kind of slipping through a little bit. So that's why we're going to use a washer. Okay, this bottom one is going to be just a little tight, just enough to allow this thing to kind of move back and forth up here. And then up here, we're going to put this all the way down, so that way we can easily drop the gear in later and mesh it up later. So we'll keep this all the way to the bottom. Okay, that's going to get tightened up later. So, okay, and now notice also this, the gap here. We'll probably push this out just a little bit more. I don't know, we'll see. Probably needs to come out just a little bit more. We'll see once we get this gear in here. We need to kind of push this out a little bit. Okay, so that's where we're at with that. Also, notice this is going to go tie down to the chassis here. So when I put this plate on, when you put this plate on, note that the label here needs to be facing out. If you put this in backwards, the label's going to be facing in. It's not going to be as aesthetically pleasing. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is mount this case. Notice there's no gears in it yet. So we're going to mount this case. We clean this up pretty well. And that's the bottom, because I can see the marks on here. So we're going to mount this case like this. And like this. Okay. So for the mounts, we're going to use 4 flathead 8mm screws. Okay. And how is this going to mount to the plate? That's where these things come in. So you'll see the 3 hexagonal recesses there. You're going to put this in, and those recesses serve a purpose. When you tighten this up, it's going to keep these things from turning. So there's one. And you want to push them down into the recess, right? There's 2. There's the 3rd one here. Okay. So we're going to use the flatheads because the chassis here is countersunk. And I know this seems so clumsy for me doing this, but I'm trying to keep this angled for the camera. Otherwise, I'd be probably just doing this on my lap. So bear with me here. This 4th one is actually this screw right here. We're going to take that out because we want to make sure it all matches. That 4th screw there holds this little piece. You'll see how that comes into play later. So now we're going to set this guy aside. I'm going to bring these guys into play here. So this guy here is going to have a bearing, which it already does. Okay. And then we're going to basically, so this is already in play here. Okay, so what we're going to need here at the top is, let me see if I can find it here. It's one of these guys. Okay, so that's going to go on the top here. And then on the bottom, we're going to have a 10mm screw here. So we're going to need a couple of parts here. Okay, so what we're going to need is this guy and this guy. You want to make sure you grease this up. It's a little bit dirty, but you want to make sure you grease this up. This has already got ample amount of grease, so I'm not going to bother, but what you want to do, there's a notch in this. I don't know if you can see it there. There's a notch in this. And this piece, this shaft here has a notch as well. So when this slides in, you know, it's going to match up. You got to kind of turn it a little bit so then make sure that it goes into the notch correctly. Okay. So I'm going to take this piece here, pop that in there, slide the shaft in this way. Okay, so I know I felt the notch in there when I turned it, because I can turn it right now and it'll turn, but then when it hits the little notch, it pushes itself in. Okay, so now that we got that in play, we can put both of these pieces back together. Now I don't know if this matches the manual or not, because remember, we already had this assembled and we disassembled it. So some of the pieces, like this piece, would have been separated. Some of these pieces were still screwed on or intact. So, but technically they're loose pieces that you have to assemble. Okay, so now that we got that in play, we have this guy that goes here. And then we have 10mm screws, 1, 2, 3, well, that one's already there. So 1, 2, 3 that we gotta put in play here. These are 10mm, 3mm screws, 10mm in length, flatheads. Again, these were already assembled and we didn't disassemble the whole thing. So these things obviously were pre-assembled, but you'd be putting these things in next, these rod ends. Okay, so that's so far what we've got. So now we're going to mount this to the chassis. Now this is already in place there. We're going to replace these screws here with these these black flatheads. And these would be 8mm. So now that we've got that in play, this guy's going to come in here like this, and it's going to line up on the bottom here. It's these last 4 holes here that you want, okay? All right, so we've got so far. Okay, so now we're going to put in the rear gears. Now, keep in mind, this was already assembled, but you do have to assemble these. There's 3 screws that hold the plates together, and then there's these bearings that go in afterwards. So this is one of them, and then you have this other one here. Oops, let me grab that. So you have this other one here that you have to assemble also. There's a shaft that goes in, and then there's the bearings, and then there's these little E-clips that hold the shaft in place. Okay, so keep that in mind. These are already assembled, but if you're doing a brand new kit, you're going to have to assemble those. So let's do the rear, because at least I know what I'm doing here. So the rear, this has to go in like so. Just drops right in. And then this guy here will need to mesh with this guy right here. So that guy should drop in like so. Okay. So now I need the cover to this, which is this guy here. And you see these little tabs will slide in over the bearings and over the shaft, like so. Okay, these are 10 millimeter flathead, and there's 3 of them. Okay, so now let's see if I remember how to do this front. I should probably break open the manual, but yeah. See, there should have been a hole. Oh, okay. There's a hole there right behind this rod end, and that's where that piece kind of needs to slide in. So when I disassemble this, I must have just go ahead and left the, I must have taken these apart and left the little rod intact, so the little shaft. Okay, so there's that little E-clip. Now I can slide this out. Okay, so now we can slide this guy in. See, that's how that's supposed to go. Okay, we want to also make sure that this aligns properly and meshes with the gear that's already there, which it does. That's how we know we got it in right. The shaft and pushes all the way through like that. Now we can put this guy back. That click is the E-clip going back in place. So there we go. Okay. Now we can put this guy here. Only one way you can fit. The big fat guy has to go against the mesh against that. There we go. Okay. So there's that. Now where's the cover to this guy here? There's the cover. Okay. And again, 10 millimeter flatheads. Okay. So now the next thing we're going to do, now that we've got, you can see the bottom, looks very nice. All black screws, beautiful. So now we come back to the rear where the engine is. Now again, we disassembled, so some of this stuff is already built here. There's a bearing, there's the first gear, there's the spur, there's this little plastic piece that's going to slide into here, So this is going to go like this, and it just slide right in like that. See, we're going to have to pull that little spur gear out just a tiny bit on the motor side, but we kind of already knew that. So we'll get to that in a minute. We needed to do something here though. We had to do this before we slid that in. So this drive shaft, let's make sure that it gets in here first on this side. See the flat? See, there's a flat piece to the shaft, to the drive shaft here. So okay. All right. Okay, now I know you see that there's, you know, how is this going to work? There's no gear meshing there. And we have another gear somewhere in here. There it is over here. That's left. But we don't do that just yet. What I'm going to do right now, though, is I am going to adjust this gear here so it meshes nicely and tighten these screws up. So first things first. I'm sliding that out just a little bit. So this spur gear here is right smack in the middle. And tightening it up. And then remember, this moves in and out, but I don't have to move it in too much, the motor too much. It's pretty good where it's at. So I'm just going to go ahead and tighten this up here just the way it is right now. We tighten the top one and then tighten the bottom one now. Okay. So now we need to put this top plate on. Okay. So we need to take a couple of these screws off that we saved. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe I have $10mm screws that long that are black. I'm gonna have to check and see what I've got in inventory here. But before doing so, this plate is gonna need this spacer here attached to it. And that spacer is gonna go on the corner here, and it's gonna have an 8mm flathead. Okay, and then the spacer should line up with this hole right here in front of the motor. That's how you know everything's lining up. A little motor tab there presenting a little bit of a challenge. Okay. There we go. I want to bend it back in because I don't want it to get in the way. So it presented a little bit of a issue getting this top plate on because of these tabs on the motor, but I bent them out a little bit. The wires should be coming from the top as well, so keep that in mind. Also, you'll notice that the motor comes at an angle. Don't be caught off guard with that. That's normal. You can see that the screw mounts here are at an angle and the plate is at an angle, so don't be freaked out about that. Okay, so now that we got the top plate on, there's 3 10mm flatheads that we got to put in here. Okay, so now we got this guy here. This was got already the bearings in it, already got the shaft in it. So what we're going to do with this guy is this puppy pops right into there. Okay, so now you can see the spur gear, motor, and everything. Sorry, it's turning, which should. Okay, so now that the gears are in place, we put the cover on, which is this guy. I shouldn't see any gaps. There we go. No gaps between the plate and the cover. So now I don't have the screws for the cover are 18mm screws, and I don't have 18mm flathead black that are hex. So I'm going to have to use the original screws here. There should be 3 of them. All right, so that takes care of that. Okay, so now that I got the drivetrain pretty much in place, let's pause here for a second. Let me regroup and get the rest of the parts ready for building the rest of the chassis around this.